Well, if you came to this talk hoping to learn more about how to launder money through mixing services, I have to disappoint. But I will tell you about BestMixer, the security practices of its users, and their insights. This is joint work by my colleagues at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'm grateful to be here. First, I will explain how a centralized Bitcoin mixing service works. As we all know, decentralized doesn't mean anonymous. Blockchains without privacy-enhancing features allow everyone to follow funds across each successive transaction. Users started to realize this traceability, and this created a demand for products and services selling anonymity in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Bitcoin mixers emerged as one of these services, promising to break the connection between inputs and outputs by mixing funds through many transactions. But who uses this kind of a mixing service, and for what? Well, there is this presumed usage of mixing service that's largely criminal. This comes from links with cybercrime, for example, ransomware payments and online anonymous markets, advertisements on underground forums, often by the mixing services themselves, and takedown of mixers by law enforcement, which provide evidence of money laundering through these services. There are, however, also reasons to use mixers that stem from privacy-conscious reason. For example, to safeguard one's privacy when making donations, or simply to ensure anonymity in the Bitcoin blockchain, especially, for example, after a data leak, as discussed before. So all of these users have in common that they want to use mixing services to enhance their security and obfuscate both their identity and the origin of funds. But by using a centralized mixing service, users are exposed to several risks. Users need to transfer funds to a centralized service, therefore losing control and access of the funds during the mixing. This means users do not know whether the service is a scam, meaning they can lose their funds, if the mixer correctly mixes to achieve security, meaning their addresses might still be linkable, or if the mixer employs any data retention policies, privacy regulations at all, meaning information about their identity might be at risk. This made us ask the question, which mitigation strategies, if any, do users employ? And in order to answer this question, we studied scam, financial, and identity attribution mitigation strategies of users. We were granted access to data of the Bitcoin mixing service bestmixer.io. BestMixer had both a clear web and a Tor hidden service, and it worked as follows. If you made a mixing transaction, you would receive a BestMixer code that essentially worked as a user ID. If you would input this code at your next transaction, BestMixer made sure that you would not receive coins from a previous transaction. You could enter between 1 and 10 output addresses, meaning that the amount you transferred into the mixing service as an input could be split up to a maximum of 10 output transactions. And based on the number of output addresses and the chosen mixing pool, the mixing fee was then calculated. Finally, for each output address, a transfer delay could be set. This meant that there would be a time between each payout transaction. We then looked at other centralized mixers, because if we're going to study the way users interact with this service, we wanted to verify that these features were used by other mixers and are still in use now. So we compared the functionality of BestMixers to 4 mixers that were active in the time period BestMixer was active, and 3 that are still active now. And we found actually that all features, often also combined in one mixer, were and are available at other centralized mixers. So the data for this was obtained by Dutch law enforcement through legal seizure and wiretaps during a criminal investigation. It was cleared for research purposes by consulting our IRB, by public prosecutors, privacy officers, and law enforcement, which included an anonymization process for PII, for example, IP addresses. Besides BestMixer data, we had access to historical Maxmind databases for GeoIP and proxy detection, the Bitcoin blockchain for validation purposes, CoinCap for historical Bitcoin to USD conversion, and Chainalysis for the market share and cluster attribution data. After we did both an extensive internal and external validation, which you can read in the paper, of the ground truth data, and using the additional sources for data enrichment, we had access to 15,574 transactions of 800 8,838 users in the time period between July 2018 and May 2019. And for each transaction, we observed the deposit address, date and timestamp, deposit amount in Bitcoin and USD, number of output addresses, the anonymized IP address, and the user ID. And to give you an idea of the scale of the funds that flowed through BestMixer, on average, users transacted about $2,888. The largest transaction, just one single transaction, is a bit more than $1 million. Daily, it's almost $250,000, which totaled up to $45 million over its lifetime. But due to the wiretap not being active the whole time period, there were multiple gaps in the ground truth data. So the estimated total mixed amount is $192 million US. So, scam mitigation. For scam mitigation strategy, we first analyzed whether users would test the service. Again, if you would transact such a large amount, you might want to know if it actually works. And we did this by analyzing recurrent users. So if you think of recurrent users as having a chain of reactions ordered in time, we hypothesized that if there existed a general trend of test transactions, the amount of first transaction being the lowest of the total chain, that would be higher than could be explained from the random chance of the first being the lowest. We found no such trend, and also not for users who mixed more than $1,000. We did, however, find a few users whose transactions followed this pattern. For mixing intensity, we looked at the average transaction value and whether there was a difference between one-time users and returning users. While their mean is not significantly different, the distribution show a larger spread actually in the transaction volume of one-time users, the above, than the returning users below. And this means that also users who just used the service once felt confident enough to mix large amounts. So we found that users of BestMixers entrusted the service with, on average, a high transaction volume, almost $3,000 per transaction. And at the same time, we did not find any evidence for test transactions. Therefore, the effort users put into mitigating any risk of scam seems to be limited. Then, financial attribution. Earlier work showed that just using one output address increases the chance of a successful demix. We saw, however, no clear use of multiple output addresses, as you can see. Users specified on average 1.34 output addresses, and 81% of all transactions just had one output address. And when we looked at distributions and delays, it turns out that users prefer to get their money out early. And additionally, the time delay that was maximally set was lower than was 28 hours, which is way lower than the 72 hours that you could set in BestMixer. So most of the transactions were not associated with multiple output addresses, and users could set different delay timings and change the payout distribution, but very few users utilized these three options. And those who did often chose the same quick and dirty pattern. Little to no delay, only one output address, and in the case of two outputs, the largest payout to the first. So in short, we could not find evidence for strategies to mitigate the risk of financial attribution. For identity attribution mitigation, we studied the proxy usage at the transaction and user level. At the transaction level, we looked at the share of transactions with an obfuscated IP address and found that 61% of all transactions were made through some kind of proxy. Of these, 68% was made via server at a corporation, such as a hosting provider, 10% was linked to an identified VPN, and 6% of the transaction came from the hidden service or an identified or exit node. And at the user level, we were interested in the consistency and found that only about half of users obfuscated the IP address for every transaction they made. So the results for identity attribution mitigation strategy showed that users did turn to a VPN, access the hidden service, and used different IP addresses for different transactions. However, still a great part of users did not make use of any of these obfuscation strategies. Around 52% of returning users made at least one transaction with a non-anonymous IP address, leaving them vulnerable to de-anonymization of all transactions by just that one transaction. And this is rather remarkable because these strategies are quite low in effort and very effective in the mitigation of the risk of identity attribution. So, overall, our findings show that the adoption of strategy to mitigate these risks are limited, while the transaction volumes that users entrusted BestMixer with are high. So users do seem to have a reasonable amount of trust in centralized mixing services. And the remaining questions are, is this trust because of something BestMixer did specifically? And if not, what are other possible explanations? So this trust could be explained from BestMixer's reputation, from its affiliation with Deep.web, its active presence on bitcointalk.org, and its communication of its mixing security features. However, the same functionalities, as I said before, were found on other mixers who also had the same presence on dark web forums, and we analyzed the market share. And BestMixer neither seemed to have been like a smaller player with a well-known underground customer base, nor a large firm that strove to obtain a mainstream legitimate reputation. So we believe that this willingness to trust BestMixer is not inherently related to BestMixer itself, but rather the result of this information asymmetry between users and service providers. So the service providers know their own data retention policies, as well as their mixing algorithm, security features. Users do not have access to that information, nor can they validate any of the security and privacy claims made. And as a result, users just need to trust the mixing services. However, an alternative explanation is that there's a dominant type of user who does not simply trust mixing services, but accepts the risk that mixing services bring along. Criminals using traditional cash-out techniques are willing to accept a significant loss of their criminal proceeds, sometimes up to 50%. The fee BestMixer asked was just merely 0.5 to 3.5%. In that sense, mixing services like BestMixer provide plenty of room to take risk and potentially lose some funds in the process. Thank you.